Welcome to the show, Our Democracy, The CJR Show. In this show, we will discuss questions of democracy, governance, elections, and other topical issues in Guyana and occurrences in countries around the world. We hope the show will be of interest to everyone. So let's begin the show. Good day. Welcome to another in the series, Our Democracy, The CJR Show. Today is Wednesday, June the 4th, 2025. In today's show, I will share with you two important topics. First, I will share with you my response to a letter to the press written by a Guyanese trade unionist. And secondly, I will attempt to expose the conspiracy theorists in our midst in Guyana today. So let's dive into the first issue. Here in Guyana, we have a trade unionist by the name of Mr. Lincoln Lewis. Mr. Lewis recently wrote a letter to the editor of Guyana's mainstream media. I chose to share my response to Mr. Lewis with you because of the topical and controversial issues raised in his letter, the tone of his language, and the abusive and insulting, as well as his bullisome nature of the letter. These matters aside, let me continue. In his letter, Mr. Lewis made three, what I would describe as or else demands, which he wants implemented in 90 days. The first demand was a clean, credible, and voters list. 2, biometric voter verification. And 3, total reform of GCOM. Having laid down his demands, Mr. Lewis then proceeded to issue what implicitly was an ultimatum. Quote, I urge my fellow Guyanese to support every lawful action necessary to protect our democratic rights. We cannot remain silent while our democracy is being dismantled before our eyes. And the time to act is now, not tomorrow, now, end of quote. Mr. Lewis's call for lawful action is, in effect, a euphemism for protest actions. And his talk about protecting what he described as our democratic rights sounds rather Rip Van Winkle-ish. I searched for references for a similarly combative call by Lewis during the March-August 2020 period, when persons associated with the APNU-AFC were trampling on the democratic rights of the electorate to elect the government of their choice. Predictably, I came up empty-handed. I can only conclude that Mr. Lewis's reference to democratic rights is a political football to be kicked around so long as it is the PPPC who is in government. Standing on a high ground built of male bovine manure, Mr. Lewis proceeded to make a flawed comparative so-called analysis to justify his call for elections not to be held unless his three demands are met. This is what he wrote. Quote, in 1990, responding to demands from political parties and civil society, President Desmond Hoyt rescinded the prorogation of Parliament to address urgent calls for electoral reform, end of quote. Mr. Lewis then made an unhinged leap from 1990 to 2025, suggesting that President Ali should do as Mr. Hoyt did in 1990. In so doing, he conveniently overlooked the fact that President Hoyt did not agree to institute a slew of electoral reforms as an act of benevolence. He did so under immense pressure. I took the opportunity to remind Mr. Lewis that Mr. Hoyt was called upon by the then U.S. Bush administration and a number of American congressmen and senators, as well as Canadian and British parliamentarians, as well as the Carter Center, to implement electoral reforms at that time in Guyana. At first, he deemed the electoral reforms what he described as logistical nightmares, but under pressure, he relented. Further, Mr. Hoyt was cautioned that failure to hold free and fair elections would in effect jeopardize his IMF-funded economic recovery program, known as the ERP. In case Mr. Lewis may have experienced a senior moment, I reminded him that domestically, pressure was exerted by the joint political opposition under the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy, PCD, whose leaders were also pressing for electoral reforms. More significantly, the business community, as well as the heads of the Catholic and Anglican churches in Guyana at that time, joined in the call for free and fair elections. Since Mr. Lewis may deny that he's in another stratosphere, I asked him to say whether the conditions today are similar to those that existed in 1990. And maybe he can offer an explanation, if he can, about what's keeping the leaders of the political opposition, who, rather than flocking together, are at each other's throats with daggers drawn, more so when the benefactors and mediators have all failed, having been effectively sidelined. While Mr. Lewis is trying to sort out these conundrums, I suggested, if he can, to explain his assertion that, quote, the working class of this country fought hard for the right to one man, one vote, end of quote. While this assertion is noteworthy, what Lewis failed to say is why, how, and who denied the same working class the right to elect a government of their choice because of rigged elections in 1968, local government elections in 1970, elections in 1973, in the referendum in 1978, elections in 1980, 1985, and in 1990, when attempts were made to do so unsuccessfully. Then, in 2020, when it was again attempted but failed. And a big question that remains unanswered is, where was Mr. Lewis's voice during the politically stormy period of March to August 2020? Now let me continue. In a reckless and undiplomatic manner, Lewis took aim at the diplomatic community in our country, as though they are inattentive and the least concerned about the electoral process in Guyana, which is not true. Thus he wrote, quote, and we must say, too, the diplomatic community is not blameless. Too many are silent, complicit, or worse, enabling this charade. They once did the same under apartheid. They turned a blind eye in Gaza, and now they pretend not to see what's going on in Guyana, end of quote. Mr. Lewis's attack on the diplomatic community is reminiscent of the attack by PNC operatives on ambassadors, diplomats, and overseas election observers, and the attempts to remove them from the scene of the rigging that was underway at the Ashman's building, where they witnessed the chaos, confusion, and protest that resulted. And as though that was not enough, the ambassadors, diplomats, and international election observers were abused and insulted by a hostile crowd, no doubt organized by the People's National Congress, APNU, AFC. This time around, Mr. Lewis's resort to his constitutional right to freedom of speech was abused, if not weaponized, in the form of an unconstrained verbal attack on the diplomatic community here in Guyana. Mr. Lewis is one among a few in our midst who claim to represent the democratic will of African Guyanese. in pursuit of that belief. They stoke existential anxieties about elections in Guyana, linking it to ethnic insecurities and appeals to fight off claims of marginalization, using the call for free and fair elections as a false flag to do so. In this letter, Lewis sought to bolster his standing as a so-called defender of democracy, and yet simultaneously glide over many transgressions of democracy in this country. In his letter, Lewis chose not to face up to the ways in which Guyana's present reality is not in sync with his past self, or how his political outlook conflicts with a much higher level of political awareness of Guyanese electorate compared to where it was more than 50 years ago. That being said, let's now move on to the next topic, which is about the conspiracy theorists in Guyana, meaning persons in this country who spout a whole host of conspiracy theories about what's going on in this country. The individual with a conspiratorial mind feels and sees himself as a protagonist of a particular school of thought. In the Guyanese context, that school of thought is fundamentally anti-PPP, racist, and talk about marginalization. In his Politics 101 podcast, the conspiracy theory is reinforced by Mr. David Hines, who creates a fantasia to make his audience and viewers believe that the threat to them is real. In that regard, the podcaster or conspiracy theorists usually seek to conceal their racist views by way of a conspiracy pathway. The conspiracy-minded individuals and others, like Hines of his ilk, are like the shaman actor on stage. We have had many of this kind before, who, with their embodied beliefs, try to evoke the emotions and involve the watcher audience of their podcast so intensely that everybody gets deeply interested. The answer to conspiracy theories is more education and more rational weighing of information sources. Conspiracy theories are not just because people get hooked on alternative sources of information or preference for limited information. My point is that these days we are all awash with information, misinformation, and fake news almost on a daily basis. As elections 2025 season draws nearer with every passing day, we should bear in mind that short-sightedness or the lack of the electors' foresight could result in serious personal problems or regrets. On elections day, an elector votes, let's say for example, on election day an elector goes to vote for the opposition. And the next day, that elector is in tears because he or she wants their vote back for not having foreseen that the vote cast was not in favor of the PPPC, but in favor of the opposition. The problem is that the elector is unable or was unable to think into the future. It is simply and more logically that they had a different concept of what is meant by change rather than an exchange, and that the vote cast is final for 5 years, lasting for their choice of what they voted for. My advice to Guyanese electorate is to vote wisely and to let their conscience be their guide. Peace, progress, and prosperity must be the answer. This has brought me to the end of today's program. I do hope you have benefited from what I had to say on these two issues. That is to say, my response to Mr. Lincoln Lewis and an exposure of conspiracy theorists and what to look out for. I look forward to meeting with you once again on Saturday, June 7th, 2025 at 5 p.m. Please be reminded that I will now be doing my podcast every Wednesday at 3:30 p.m. Podcast will continue as usual on Saturdays at 5 p.m. Please accept my apology for any inconvenience caused. And do not forget to press the like and share buttons and subscribe to the CDR Show. I welcome and encourage you to share your views with me on the topics I discussed today or any other topic you may have in mind. Thank you and goodbye.